Over the last few decades in the United States, one of the main social issues has been the issue of race. Race seems to have permeated much of the national attention, at least from politicians and the media. And so today I thought it would be interesting to look at Christianity and the Bible in relation to race. Now, the English word race was borrowed from French. French has the word race, and the French word race means kind, breed, or lineage. In French, it was supposedly first used to refer to living things that came from a common descent. And in English, gradually, it just began to be applied to people. Now, there is no generally agreed upon definition of what race is. At one time, this definition used to be fairly accepted: an inherited biological foundation at the genetic level that results in people sharing certain distinguishing physical characteristics such as skin color and texture, eye shape, hair texture, bone structure, and perhaps also sharing certain behavioral characteristics. Now, that definition does not necessarily hold true today. We have people labeled as black who really don't look black and who you would never guess were black. So defining race by observable characteristics is not an agreed upon thing anymore. There is no generally accepted definition of race. There are different definitions of it. Now, neither is there agreement on how many races there are. Some take the position that there are 4. Caucasian, which is white; African, which is black; Asian, which is Asian; and then red, which is Native American. Others take the position that there are many more races, and they get those by dividing the main 4 up into different categories. For example, you might divide the white race up so that one subgroup is those of European descent, and then you might break that up into smaller groups, say those from Nordic areas, those from Alpine areas, and those from Mediterranean areas, and say that each one of those is a different race. If you did that, for example, you would say that people from Sweden are a different race as people from Greece. But again, there's no agreement on this. Now, although there's no generally agreed upon definition of race and no generally agreed upon number of races, there has been in the past 5 criteria associated with race. First is that the races have a biological foundation. In other words, it is something that is in you from birth. It is something you are born with. It is a part of your biology. Second, those biological formulations result in distinct racial groupings, each of which shares biological characteristics not shared by members of other races. You can think of this like flowers. There's all kinds of different flowers, but there's a daisy and there's a marigold. And they're different. They're both flowers, but they're different. And third, that the biological foundation of race is inherited. That means that you can identify a person's race by looking at their ancestry. And then fourth, the origins of the different races are associated with different geographical areas. For example, you would say that the Chinese are a different race than Americans. We live in a different area. And fifth, the biological foundation is seen primarily in physical appearance and also sometimes in behavior. And remember, that fifth one was the way we said at one time race was defined. So those 5 things generally describe what most people think of when they think of race. Now, the origins of the modern concept of race trace back to the rise of science. mainly in the 1600s and 1700s. And the man most closely identified with that is a man named Carl Linnaeus, and he lived in the 1700s, and he wanted to classify all living things, whether plant or animal, into a system he called binomial nomenclature, and binomial just means each one was given two names. All living organisms were placed into groups. The first name is the genus, the second name is the species. And so he sought to classify all living things in there to provide a standardized name for every different kind of living thing. And Linnaeus was one of the first to group humans with apes. And he did that because of their anatomical similarities. He saw humans and apes as different species within the same genus. And then he went on and he subdivided the human species into 4 varieties based on skin color and what he believed to be inherent behavioral traits. And so race under that system would have been known as a subspecies. And it was during this time that the French word race began to be adopted to refer to his various subspecies. Now, a little later, another man came along, a man named Blumenbach, and he classified human beings into 5 races. And he did it based on the shape of their head and skin color. And he is the one who was credited with referring to the white race as Caucasian, because he believed the ideal climate conditions for early humans would have been in what is known as the Caucasus region, which is near the Caspian Sea, in the area where Russia and Iran come together. And so the belief at that time was that the white race was the original race, and other races were the result of transformations out of that. Now, as more time goes on, we get into the 1800s, and science was all the rage in the 1800s, and measurements were all the rage. And a man named Samuel Morton measured cranial size to distinguish human beings. And he concluded that Caucasians had, on average, greater cranial volumes than other people. And he was a proponent of what is called biological determinism, which says that there is an association between people's physical characteristics and their behavior, their intelligence, their abilities, and their morals. In other words, it is the idea that some people, based on their physical characteristics, are essentially superior to others. Now, with this concept of race, race would not only refer to similar looking people, but also would refer to people with similar behavioral traits, abilities, and morals. Now, as the 20th century developed, a man named Franz Boas was interested in the study of skull dimensions in the different races. And he came up with the idea that the form of people's skulls and dimensions depended on their cultural and environmental factors, but that behavior is most influenced by social factors, not by inheritance. And he maintained that the actual biological differences between the races are small, and that there are no naturally superior races. So that's a run-through quickly of the modern concept of race. To back up, it started when science got started back in the 1600s, and it started as a byproduct of trying to scientifically name all the different life forms on Earth. As this was extended to naming different looking human beings, the different classifications began to be studied, and various conclusions were drawn about the differences observed within the different classifications. And as we have seen as I ran through that history, the concept of race has constantly changed. And we have also seen that race, as we think of it, is a fairly recent development. The Bible contains no concept of race. The word race is not in the Bible. Now that does not mean that some modern Bible translations won't have it in there. A lot of them do. But that's absolutely a mistranslation. There is no word in the Bible that translates as race. That word is actually translated as peoples. So you may have a Bible that says all races or something like that. That ain't in there. It's peoples. Some Bibles instead will say all nations. They'll translate that word nations. That's not in there either. Just as the concept of race was a concept that developed in the 16 and 1700s, so is the modern concept of nations something that did not develop until, say, the 14 or 1500s. There is no concept of nations as we think of nations today in the Bible. Back in biblical times, it was just peoples. And this is another indication of how careful you have to be with what Bible translation you read. You can read some that will completely, absolutely, and totally mislead you. So in the Bible, what we see is the concept of peoples. And there are two different ways that concept of peoples is applied in the Bible. In one, people are classified based on the area in which they live. If you read the Old Testament, you'll hear a lot of names of people in there. For example, you hear about the Moabites. Well, the Moabites were people who lived in what was called the land of Moab. You'll hear about the Ammonites. They were people who lived in the land called Ammon. And there are many different groups of people referred to that way in the Old Testament. They're referred to as inhabitants of the land where they live. Now, a lot of those groups of people you'll find in the Old Testament, nothing in the historical record has survived about them, and no one is really sure where their particular piece of land was. But that's the way people are referenced. One way they're referenced in the Bible, by where they live. It's the same thing as us being referred to as North Carolinians. Now, in the other concept of people found in the Bible, people are classified based on a common ancestor. For example, the Edomites were a people who were thought to be descendants of Esau. Remember that Esau was the brother of Jacob, and Jacob stole Esau's birthright by lying and deceiving his father. Now, sometimes these two ways of classifications of people are merged. The Edomites were seen as descendants of Esau, but they lived in the land of Edom. So in this case, the classification refers both to a common ancestor and the area that they live in. It refers to their ancestor Esau and also the land of Edom. Having a common ancestor or living in a certain area is obviously not the same thing as race. The Bible does not mention race. I remember one time, a number of years ago, I was doing a Bible study series at a local church, and I gave the participants one night, they could write on a piece of paper questions they wanted answered, and I'd do that the next week. And I got several, this must have been a hot topic in that church, but I got several that says, what does the Bible say about interracial marriage? Well, that's the easiest question I've ever had to answer. Nothing. It says nothing because it's not in there. So that was like that. Well, I can answer this one pretty quick. So there is no concept of race in the Bible. It is a relatively modern development. The concept of race came out of what's called the scientific revolution in the middle part of the previous millennium. Now, one question that has never been answered is, why are there different races? No one knows. There are all kinds of different opinions floating around about that, but no one knows. And another unanswered question is, what are the differences between the races? Again, no one knows. There's all kinds of different opinions floating around, but in reality, no one does know. The interpretation of this stuff depends highly upon what is permissible in the age in which you live. You remember we were talking a little while ago, and some of the people that were thinking about race in the 17 and 1800s, they were thinking of it in terms of certain races being superior to others. And back then, that was permissible. In the 17 and 1800s, it was permissible to think that some races may be superior to others, and so it's not surprising to see scientific theories develop based on that. Today, it is not possible to think, it is not permissible to think that some races may be superior to others, so it's not surprising to find today scientific theories being put out that say no race is superior to others. If you haven't noticed yet, if you look at it enough, you will notice that science always agrees with what is permissible to think at any particular time. Always does. Science is a reflection of what is permissible to think in society. So that's talking about race. It's not in the Bible. But there is something very interesting that I would like for us to think about in regard to race. And that is about the origin of races. Now, traditionally, Christianity has held on to something called monogenesis. And the term monogenesis just means that Christianity has traditionally held that all human beings trace their ancestry back. If you go back far enough, you'll end up with Adam and Eve. That's called the idea of monogenesis. That all human beings descended exclusively from Adam and Eve. Like you have Adam and Eve, and then that's it, so just them. And from just them, nothing else added, all the human beings that ever lived descended from them. That's monogenesis. Now, of course, there's not a lot of Christians anymore, unfortunately, who believe Adam and Eve ever existed. Most Christians today believe in evolution. However, a lot of evolutionists also believe in monogenesis. You know, that used to be a very popular thing. It became a fad back 10 or 15 years ago to say that DNA researchers had traced back the origin of the human race, the entire human race, to some woman in Africa. But some evolutionists hold that at some point in the distant past, there was one unique creature that crawled up out of the sea, one of them, crawled up onto the shore, and eventually evolved to become the parent of all human beings. And that all human beings could trace their ancestry, if you could do that, back to this one creature that crawled up out of the sea, and then eventually evolved over billions of years into human beings. Other evolutionists, though, hold that many different creatures in different parts of the world quite independently crawled up out of the sea and evolved into human beings, so that human beings do not share a common ancestor. That's called polygenesis. In other words, in different parts of the world at different times, life gradually evolved into human beings. My ancestor, primarily that I evolved out of, may have crawled out of the sea somewhere down in South America. And the ancestor that you primarily evolved out of may have crawled out of the sea somewhere in India or somewhere. So this idea presupposes that evolving into human beings is the natural course of things, that independently in various parts of the world, life was evolving onto its own into human beings. And so human beings do not share a common ancestor. Other evolutionists hold to a form of polygenesis that says that different life forms gradually emerged in different parts of the world that were maybe similar to human beings but not really human beings, and that human beings were superior and killed those life forms. Yet other evolutionists who hold to polygenesis say that different life forms in different parts of the world gradually emerged from the sea in different parts, like some emerged in Japan, some emerged in India, some in Australia, some in South America, some in Africa, some in North America, some in Russia, and all these different beings that came out of the sea and developed into some kind of human-like thing. They're not really human beings, but over eons and eons, as these human-like creatures interbred with each other, the interbreeding of all these different species resulted in us, in different human beings. So you can see there's no agreement on any of this stuff about where human beings came from. But I thought it was interesting that although Christianity has traditionally interpreted things, monogenesis, saying that all human beings descend exclusively from Adam and Eve, there's a passage in the Bible that states that at least at one time that was not true, and that's the passage we heard from Genesis today for our Old Testament reading. And there is the account of how some spiritual beings that are referred to as sons of God came down to earth, had sex with human women, and produced offspring. And these are the ones that are called the mighty men of old, men of renown, giants. And so that idea is that some kind of spiritual beings came down, had sex with human women, and produced half human, half spiritual being children. And so Christianity, though, has traditionally held that all of those beings perished in the flood. In fact, most of Christianity has held that that's the reason God sent the flood in the first place, to kill off that race of half human, half spiritual beings that came down, sons of God from heaven that came down and had sex with human women. Now, interestingly, there is a tradition in ancient Christianity and in ancient Judaism that said that Noah himself was one of the descendants of these mighty men of old, these men of renown. In other words, that Noah himself was one of the descendants of some of these unions between sons of God and human women. And if that is true, then it would mean that the idea of monogenesis from Adam and Eve is not true, that human beings today are a mix of the ancestry of Adam and Eve and whoever these spiritual beings were in Genesis called the sons of God. So see, even in an indirect manner, the Bible does not help us with the origin of races. You can see the Bible as pointing to monogenesis, or depending on how you interpret what it says about Noah, you could see it as pointing to polygenesis, with modern human beings being not the result of just Adam and Eve. Unfortunately, the Bible does not help us when thinking about issues of race. Race is a concept that is not contained in the Bible. As far as we can determine, or at least according to what's generally accepted today, the concept of race is a relatively modern development. I know one time years ago we talked about the issue of abortion, and we said the Bible does not speak directly to abortion. Abortion is possible only because of modern medicine. There was no modern medicine in the time of the Bible, so there would be no reason for the Bible to speak to that. Just the same, there was no concept of race during biblical times, so there would have been no reason for the biblical writers to mention it. They would not have even thought about it, would not have been on their radar screen. There are many issues in modern life that the Bible does not directly address. And that makes it very difficult for us, because as we try to navigate our way through some of these issues, we can't just go to the Bible and get the answer. It's something that we really have to do some serious thinking about, and serious soul searching about, and serious studying about. And it's an issue that we don't need knee-jerk reactions to. That we need people that we need to, now wait a minute, let's sit down and think. Let's calm down a little bit and sit down and think. So the Bible does not contain the answer to all questions, but the Bible contains all things necessary for our salvation. And that is true with the issue of race.